Gosh, I wish my students clapped for me when I when I talked. That's really nice. What a warm welcome. Thank you all for coming out today, both in person and virtually. Hopefully you can hear me okay from here. I'll try not to wander away from the mic. Are we good?
Just a little bit. You're taller than me.
Oh, I'm tall. It's the heels, the foolish heels. So again, thank you. I think a week from tomorrow, we'll all be gathering our families together for Thanksgiving celebrations, but thank you for coming out right before that. I look forward to doing the same myself. I want to talk a little bit before we get into the lecture about myself, just to tell you where I'm coming from and how I became curious about what is underneath our clothing. I come to you as three people today. I come to you, one, as a curious child. Curious about my mother's beautiful evening gowns that I unfortunately took apart, much to her dismay, and her beautiful ballet costumes. I really loved the interiors of them. I loved seeing all the weird seams and bones and ribbons that are in handmade clothing. So a curious child in that way. Also, as a curious child, I realized that we do judge each other by what we wear. We judge our books by our covers. And so I sort of understood at a young age that what you wore could tell something about you, and what you wore could tell other people something, that you didn't, maybe want them to know, or maybe you did want them to know. So that's the first thing I come to you as. The second thing I come to you as is a draper and a sculptor. Eventually, I learned to sculpt material, and some of us may remember having home ec and learning to sew, right? I wish that it still existed today. So growing up in the woods of Maine, there isn't a lot of, you'd be shocked at how little fashion there is up there. So you had to learn to sew. You had to learn to sew, and I used to watch Style with Elsa Clench on CNN on Sundays. I don't know if anyone remembers that show. Or I had to go to a drugstore to look at a fashion magazine, and that was sort of the only exposure to fashion that I had. So between that and learning to sew, I started to create my own clothing, my own costumes. So that leads into that draper and sculptor. And so I really loved working with material, and I loved the way it moved. I loved the way it moved against the bodies. My mom was a dancer, and all little girls take ballet class, or a lot of them do. And so I loved looking at ballet costumes and all of that. So that was my fascination with sculpting. And then the final person I come to you as is a dedicated mentor and teacher, and so an educator. And I want to educate myself as well as share everything I know with other people, with you here today. I have one thing that I have to admit, it's a little less about Sargent and a little bit more about the fashion, but he is in there. I think there's a quote maybe from our curator or from Sargent himself, he thought himself a painter and a dressmaker, and I'll have to admit to you that as a dressmaker, it's a different skill and a refined skill. Both painting and dressmaking require a lot of talent. So, what we don't see, right? That's sort of my fascination. So I encourage you all to take a moment and think, what are you wearing underneath? What do we not see? Don't have to tell me, I don't need to know. But what we don't see, what's under there? And for some people it might be nothing, and that's great. And for some it might be a lot of things. You could count the undergarments. You could also think about the quality of material that's touching your skin. We are enveloped by material and clothing every day, most of our waking hours, maybe unless you're in a nudist colony. So we're really sort of surrounded by these beautiful garments or workable garments, and they protect us from the elements, they show us something, they show other people something, and so that's my sort of fascination, so I'm hoping to share that with you. Okay, let's see if I can make this work. What we don't see. So I'm not going to talk too much about Madam X because there is another exhibitor or lecturer that's going to be talking about her, but I want you to think about what you don't see in that image. I know it's a controversial image for Sargent, and so that's something to think about. The other thing about what we don't see is just like the undergarments we wear underneath our clothing, painters have an undergarment of paint underneath their paintings, right? So they have lines that you're not seeing. We know that Sargent scraped away paint and put new paint on. I was married to a painter, and I know that he would just gesso his canvas, and then he would paint this beautiful umber color underneath all his paintings to give it a glow. And so both with clothing and undergarments, the same thing is true with paintings. There's something we don't see. And I, again, find both things very fascinating. So underpinnings. I'm going to talk a lot bit about undergarments, as you might have already guessed. It is a little racy, so I apologize for those of you who don't feel comfortable talking about underpants. But there's something, sort of shocking about, does anyone know anything about Victorian undergarments? Yes, thank you, my friends in the front. So some of you might know this, but women didn't wear a lot of underpants back in the day, and if they did, they were open-crotched for practical reasons, and also because it was immodest. So if you think of it, has anyone worn a romper and had to go to the bathroom and then all of a sudden you have to get fully undressed? Well, think of that with Victorian undergarments. If you're wearing a romper underneath your corset, you certainly don't want to get all of that stuff off, including to go pee. So their crotches were often open. And so what you're seeing here is what's called a combination, which is one of the first layers. It's closest to the skin. The other thing about Victorians you should know is that it's hard to wash a corset. And so really some of these undergarments are protecting the outer garments from the human, right? So that this is what you can wash, which is more easily washed than a corset, which might be more difficult to wash because you'd get rid of some of the sizing and some of the ability that it has. So a little bit of pantaloons, drawers, or drawers, underpants, all of those things. So what you're seeing, and I don't know if you can see it on here, let me go to the next one, is there's really no seam right there down the center, which is sort of shocking, right? You would think Victorians were so modest, but really they like to have a lot of air in there. It's very healthy for them, and again, it's easy for those bio movements. Now, I'm sure as women had menstruated, there was something that they used in order to protect themselves from that, but we know that as far as when that wasn't happening, they had these. Some women wouldn't wear them at all. There were closed crotch, but these were more popular. So lots, and these are actually, I think, exhibits from the MFA itself. As we go through, too, the undergarments were, at first when they started wearing these underpants, they were very simple and not decorated. And then they become more and more decorated as they go on. So as we go through to the end of this century, the end of the 19th century, they become more and more decorated, more and more delicate, more harder to wash. So, and this is an example of a closed crotch one. Okay, the other thing we use, so think of this. So we mold our bodies. So I know that in this exhibit we talk a little bit about Sargent sort of making editorial changes to women with his paintbrush, maybe elongating something, maybe changing their costume, maybe changing the color of their costume. Gosh, wouldn't that be so easy? I think if I could have a magic sort of like a superpower, it would be to be able to touch anything and change the color of it with just one wish, like pink opalescent glitter, done, right? Wouldn't you love to be able to do that to anything that you wanted? Much harder to do in fabric and sewing than it is in paint, maybe. But one thing that we all do is we mold our bodies. Someone once said to me, we build men's clothing for them to live within, and we mold women's bodies. We sculpt them and mold them and push them and squish them into different shapes, depending on what the aesthetic and ideal is. And so one way that we did that, and still kind of do it to today, if any of you wear a Spanx or a Skims or a control top pantyhose or a push-up bra, one way we did that was through corsets. And there's lots of different corsets throughout time. They kind of became extreme towards the end of this century, towards the end of the 19th century, with tight lacing and so on and so forth. And that was established by a couple of things that were invented, like eyelets, like metal eyelets, which allowed you to pull tighter, and also the slot and stud quick release center front. But we molded our bodies and we pushed our busts up and our tummies down and around and our hips out of the way. And that ideal shifted. So it shifted from one aesthetic to another towards the end of the century. And I'm really sort of covering, this is an example of 1880s corset that you're seeing on the screen here today in red, a very fashionable color. Oh wait, let me go to the next one. There you go. And you're also seeing the busk. So the busk is another thing that sort of changed and molded the bodies. So the spoon busk, which was more 1880s and before, allowed the tummy to protrude forward slightly, and it created like a little spoon for your tummy. And that moved away when we moved into the more later Edwardian shape, into a straight busk, which sort of made you arch your back much more and throw your bust forward. Neither one were particularly comfortable. They're usually stiffened by either cording or whalebone or baleen, which we can no longer, we don't kill whales for their bones anymore or their teeth. And also stiffening, like sizing, like sometimes starch and stuff like that to keep them stiff, which is why they were hard to wash. So here's a couple of good examples. So another 1880s piece I think this one's from the Met Museum. So you can see all the steel. So you're encased in steel. This is why women ate very daintily. It was hard to breathe, right? If you've ever worn sort of control top garments, you know how it can be hard to eat large meals. And there's also some fainting issues involved with this. And anyone, if there's young people that like to wear corsets today, and I encourage them to do that if that's what they wish. I don't make any judgments, so you can be with or without. But the cording helps keep the bust up. So what this garment is doing is pushing the bust fully up into the armpit and the tummy down, and elongating that middle section. And same thing here. So part of the stuff that I teach at Boston University is how to make these things, and part of my thesis was how to make these things. So I made all these corsets for each decade, starting from 1850 to 1950, and so just to experience what it was like to create those, and then fit them on a modern body, and how we sort of altered the body. So here we're sort of pushing that bust up and elongating that waist, using cording and steel, lots of steel. And here's another one from the 1890s. Same thing, delicate lace at the top to sort of soften that edge. This one's another one from the 1890s. You're seeing a straight busk here, and lots of embroidery. They became more and more decorated. Sometimes they had shoulder straps, so to keep them, that's helpful, to keep them up. And sometimes they had vents to make them more breathable. Sort of helpful. But you want a long, lean silhouette with lots of cording and corseting. Here's a very shapely one. So you're seeing how much we were able to sort of make that extreme, almost Kim Kardashian shape, or Marilyn Monroe, if you will. And then we get into something like this, which now, so we're going from 1880s where the bust is pushed up, and then eventually we allow the bust to fall down, and it's just captured. So now, by the 1900s, we're allowing that bust to fall straight down and softer. So the corset is really encapsulating the waist and the hips, and allowing the bust to rest in its more natural position to create a more S-shaped aesthetic. And we have corsets for all different kinds of occasions. We have fancy corsets. We have nursing corsets, we have riding corsets or soft corsets. We have Swiss waists for bicycling, just in case, right? All kinds. This is referring to, so now we've sculpted the body pretty tight. The other thing that we do, in case you're not as endowed as you wish, you can wear something like this, which is a corset cover, which sort of gives you a little bit more of the shape that's ideal. So it's sort of like, in theater we call them cookies, or chicken cutlets you might have heard of. It's a little stuffer that you sort of add into your bust to sort of enhance your shape, right? So those come in these forms as well. So these are sort of things that you can add into your shape. And this is all, we're just at the corset level, corset and chemise level. So we haven't even gotten to the outer garments. So you're sort of wearing all of this underneath, stuffing and fluffing. stuffing and fluffing. Bustles. So in the 1880s, for some reason, we thought it would be really lovely to have a very enhanced protrusion off the back of our bodies. Why not? You could store stuff in there, like cookies. So bustles, turnitures, sometimes they're called lobster tails because that's what they look like, is another thing that they did to add to the back of the garment to drape up. So this is 1880s, we're sort of shaping up and around. The 1880s was sort of an interesting decade because it shifted from lobster tails to then really flat shapes to then sort of rounder shapes again. But this is early 1880s. And there are a few paintings in Sargent's that come from the 1880s. Madame X was painted in 1883. So technically she would have been wearing one of these or something like it. There's also these, which are really handsome, lightweight baskets, you know, again, good for storage. These are beautiful examples from the Lowell, I don't know if anyone remembers the Lowell Textile Museum, but these are beautiful examples from the Lowell Textile Museum that we have here. So these would have been made out of cane and fabric and steel. Again, they could have been woven or knit, whatever they could do to make. Sometimes they're spiral. Really exciting things. There's also the cage crinolines, which are sort of coming from the 1850s. We had this, if any of you watch, you know, the Civil War era with those big hoop skirts. So those have sort of, we've taken that knowledge of how to keep the skirt out and sort of adopted it and made a much smaller cage crinoline. So there we are. So now we're fluffed and stuffed and extended. And now we move into petticoats, the softer. Now we need to kind of soften that a little bit, right? We don't want to see the basket coming through the skirt, so we need to slip cover a little before we get to the outside, right? And this is an example of a later 1900s petticoat. So they can be incredibly delicate and soft. You could wear multiples of these. Sometimes in the winter, you might wear a flannel or a wool one to be for warmth. It just depends on how many you needed. The cage crinoline came about because we were wearing way too many petticoats to get volume, that it was sort of counterproductive. And so that kind of hoop steel idea came from some very smart person. Them. Other petticoats and very delicate. Okay, let's talk about the dresses, right? That's what we're all here for, I think. So this is one of the dresses from the exhibit. This was actually from 1877, I would say, off the top of my head. Probably a beautiful silk velvet with, I would assume, a Duchess satin trim on it. Something you should know, I don't have really lovely photos of the interiors of these things, but just because we've done all this slip covering with these undergarments under our bodies it doesn't mean that's the end of our mystery of what we put under there. There's also lots of padding in these things sometimes. At Boston University, sometimes we get the rejects from museums that the garments that they don't want because they're too tender or just not in good quality. And what's amazing about those is I can share those with my students and we can look on the inside. And really, when you're working in theater or trying to recreate these things, to learn what they did on the inside of those garments, and that goes back to my childhood curiosity, it's like opening up a body, it's like exhuming something and looking at the skeleton and the bones and all of that on the inside of these garments. And oftentimes you would find really weird padding in places you wouldn't expect. So we know that if we push the bust up into the armpit, we also have to fill in that space up there. So oftentimes you will find padding, like fairly thick padding in the armpits of these garments sometimes to create a nice, softer, rounder shape. And when I look at modern drapers that are trying to drape for theater and they're trying to create that sort of Victorian, shape or, 1880s, 1890s shape, they mistake putting padding there. And what that does is gives you it helps accentuate that really beautiful hourglass silhouette. It kind of makes it wider at the shoulders and narrower at the waist. And so it's a trick of the trade that they were doing then too. So really trying to create a very V-shaped, beautiful silhouette. We have to assume that this is supported by one of those lovely baskets or lobster tails of some sort. And so the other thing that women did too, and that's sort of hard when you're looking at historical fashions, is they would alter a dress. So this dress initially was, I believe, built in 1882, but then was altered in 1892 to create a softer silhouette, a softer, rounder silhouette. So this beautiful velvet. And what's great is fabric can scar, so you can kind of see where it was sewn before. So what they did is they had plenty of fabric, because there was always plenty of fabrics in these skirts, is they probably recut that skirt lining. And it takes an expert in that to do that, to figure out how to hang it correctly, especially with velvet, because it has a nap. It shines funny in one direction than the other. So you have to be very wise and very smart. Amazing dressmakers. It's another great example. So this is again from 1883. So again, that basket is under there somewhere. But beautiful Duchess satin and draped ability. But also to think, remember what's underneath these things, what's holding that bust in the position that it's in, and how are they covering all that stuff. Even the outside garments had steel and whale and bones in them to keep them from moving about too much. I'm not sure how they sat down. They perched. And here's a beautiful example from the Met, this House of Worth. How Charles Worth was sort of, been given the name of like the father of couture, right? He's sort of like one of our initial people that sort of started designing gowns. Instead of you as a woman bringing your fabric to a dressmaker or a tailor and sort of picking from a book or telling them what you want, he would design gowns, and you got to choose one of those if you were so lucky. But look at the inside of that bodice, right? Sort of still laced up. And again, this is just a great example from the MFA of that sort of, they used to say you could put a tea tray on the back of it, if you so wanted, right? And another great example. So going back to that weird bustle period, you may not know this, but tennis was the first sport that women could play with men. And so they had tennis dresses. And luckily enough, they have those great bustles for where you can store your tennis balls. I think we should bring it back. I'm ready. So they're very smart about the way they use their dress and what they did with it. Another beautiful example. So you're seeing there's a lot of volume, a lot of fabric up in there that's sort of draped and pulled. It's almost like a hat in the way that we're sort of decorating the bottom half of the body. You don't see, there's very few bifurcated garments. That's sort of the thing about women wearing open crotch underpants, is that to think of fabric touching the inside of a woman's leg was sort of titillating, I guess. And a tea gown, which is really another great example of Worth. A lot of workmanship in these. So just like painters, dressmakers and seamstresses have a refined skill. They have to use, an incredible amount of ability in order to sew and manipulate fabrics and to get them to drape over our baskets, over our bum baskets. Another dress. We see a little bit more asymmetry working in these. Going forward. Some of these silks might have been weighted. They weighted silks with metal in order to make them a little heavier, more luxurious. That sometimes what maybe tarnished them, so they might have been initially black, but then they sort of turn greenish over time because the metal is sort of tarnishing. Lots of black. And this is another example. I believe this is in the exhibit as well. This is another 1880s-ish wedding dress. And so you're really seeing a very refined silhouette. And this is when we're still pushing the bust up as high as we can and filling in that armpit with lots of beading. This looks like a silk file or a bengaline, if you can see the little lines on the garment. So even saying all this, that women were wearing corsets and baskets on their bums, there were some women that pushed against this, right? That said, I don't want to be contained by that. And so we had something called pre-Raphaelites that's moved into the artistic movement. And pre-Raphaelites really wanted to be free of the corsets and all that containment and want to have a more natural beauty to them. And those translated into later into an artistic movement. And so with this next slide, we're looking at Eloise Palmer, who's probably about 17 in this painting, is wearing what might have been referred to at the time as something that's more of an artistic movement or an aesthetic dress, where there's less corseting, there's less constriction, there's a little more freedom, and a lot less of that underpinning and that control. And so when you're seeing some of these garments, and the other thing that you have to take into consideration is that both Sargent and many painters would dress their sitters with what they wanted them to wear, and Sargent specifically could change the color of something by just painting it a different color or scraping paint off and repainting over it. And he did do that. And so sometimes, as I tell my students to go, always look at paintings and look at artists to see what was really happening in those times, you have to take it with a grain of salt and understanding that they might have altered it to some degree. And here's a few other sketches of her that he did as well. So beautiful materials. He did a really amazing job sort of painting what, as a dressmaker and a sculptor, I can imagine, or I can tell by just looking at the painting what kind of material quality it is. So I might imagine that as a silk organza on the sleeve, that sort of sheerness or quality, and because of the body and the weight of it alone. And that's so helpful for us to sort of to have that knowledge. It's also really helpful for us to see what the aesthetic was. Even if he was shifting what was really happening and creating his own ideal, he had an ideal of beauty. And so for us as dressmakers and historians and costumers, we sort of need to understand that ideal of beauty so that we can recreate it to be as accurate as we can when we're making those beautiful BBC films that we all love to watch, right? This piece is another wonderfully, beautifully draped piece. It's obviously a velvet, as you can tell, with this beautiful, delicate lace. And this was probably an aniline dye. So eventually dyes became aniline, which meant that they could get more vibrant colors. So they got these more fuchsias. I think I've read somewhere that people thought it was a little garish. But to us, it just seemed, stunning and exciting and beautiful and complemented her complexion. Another thing that happened too is we're going to see this is one dress with two bodices. This is a smart thing that you can do if you want to extend your wardrobe, your luxury wardrobe, which wasn't easy to accomplish, is that you could have one dress kind of with two bodices. So one skirt with two bodices, and you're seeing this beautifully draped velvet gown from the 1890s that has, the sleeves are almost as big as the body of the garment, which is sort of, I'm not sure why we thought that was a good idea. Maybe there's baskets in those. Maybe that's where we're storing our tennis balls now. But that dress could also be an evening dress where you could just switch out the bodice. So very practical, obviously. Lots of things to do with this. And now I'd just like to go through, you look at Charles Frederick Worth, especially in his later years, which probably became House of Worth as his sons took over. So in the 1890s, it's sort of the pinnacle of fashion, sort of gets to this moment of what I think is really truly beautiful and princessy, if you will. So we're going to look at a few Worth gowns that aren't here at the exhibit. These are from the Met Museum. But he really explored how to carve material and how to get it woven in order to highlight the silhouette that he wanted. So he was getting, jacquards woven in a way that could exemplify the seaming that he used. Another beautiful piece. But you're seeing that this is sort of the start of the drop of the bust, I would say. So they're starting to allow the bust to drop down a little bit more into this. So you're seeing a difference. I'm going to go back. You're seeing a difference between the bust sort of being up and up high to now sloping down to get that we call it an S-curve shape. There might be another term for it. These are some of my favorite pieces. Butterfly piece. And this piece is in the exhibit, so this is, was I think by Sears is the one that owned it, but it's another Worth gown, and you're seeing that beautiful jacquard, and he sort of matched the print on it in that side front panel. The Gibson Girl effect. So the Gibson Girl was sort of a shocking portrait to paint of somebody in such a casual, what was that? I thought I heard somebody say something, sorry. Aesthetic, but bicycling, women started getting more and more freedoms to do sports. Obviously, tennis was first, cycling is after, and so it's such an interesting way to see that big swath of hair. She's wearing something called a shirt waist, which is a little more ready to wear than custom made, which is sort of like our foray into that. And you're seeing a lovely version, it's sort of a more walking dress version. And this is all probably about 1890s. So again, those giant sleeves for our tennis balls or our snacks. A few more Worth gowns to go through. But beautiful amounts of fabric. These dresses probably would have 8 to 10 yards of fabric in them today, if we were to recreate them today. The sleeves themselves would be a yard apiece. Very voluminous. And finally, a Worth wedding gown. And so you're seeing that bookmark, sort of like that mirror image of the brocade down the center front of that. And again, the sleeves as wide as the bodice. Really lovely. So even in creating some of these things, again, the sleeves would have been stuffed with something to keep them out and in the right position. The dress itself would have been boned as well. This is an interesting piece because it's something called a princess seam, which was sort of started during the cuirass bodice of 1880s. An afternoon dress. So you had dresses for different times of day, obviously, walking, afternoon dress, tea. It's quite a cuirass. So looking at that final silhouette that we're going to get into is that sort of old style corset, which looks fine, to the S-shaped corset. So you're seeing how the body is sort of straightened out and the back is arched quite a bit and the back of the body is pushed out. So that's when we're seeing these silhouettes that Sargent is painting. You're seeing these women with a very, almost exposed low upper body. And you're seeing that again here. You're seeing that sort of soft upper body. Now, in evening gowns, they wouldn't necessarily have been wearing corset covers on top of these things, but the corset again is very low and capturing just allowing the bust to set into it. The Worth gown. And this is a Callow Sisters dress that's here on exhibit. I think it's here on exhibit, actually. I'm not sure. And these ladies are from that same late time period. So this is a really great silhouette of what that sort of period shape is. I think there's a blank slide, sorry. Oh, no. Oh, I made an animation, I apologize. And you're seeing it sort of spin. You're seeing that shape as it comes around, sort of narrow in the front, longer in the back. Delicate materials, lightweight materials. This might be a cotton bobinette or linen bobinette, which is an open weave material. And the skill it took, again, to make these things really expert. Am I still going? Okay. So a very young lady, 1970s. Or, sorry, not 1970s. Well, maybe, actually. It could be. I was around for the 1970s. An afternoon dress. Okay, so now we've sort of talked a lot about what women would have worn or what they should have worn or what they could have worn. I want to go back and talk a little bit about those dress reformers, those people that sort of rallied against it, and also talk about something that I'm very familiar, which is theater and costume and history of costume. And so I speak a little bit about this on the audio tour, and it's a really amazing piece. So Ellen Terry played Lady Macbeth in 1889. And if you're looking at this garment and you're thinking about what's underneath, you can tell already that there's not as much support as maybe what we've seen previously, is that she's probably not wearing a corset in the way that some of those other ladies were wearing a corset. Her bust is sort of dropped for that time period. It's a much softer silhouette. We know that Sargent painted this image, and she never actually held this pose in this gown with this crown. So this is him imagining what he saw on the stage. The other thing I want to talk about, too, is a little bit about the women that made this come together. So you're looking at Alice Carr, who was the designer, the costume designer of this dress. You're looking at Ellen Terry in the middle, which is the actress who was wearing this dress. And you're looking at Ada Nettleship, who is the dressmaker who made this dress, right? So those three really talented women came together to kind of create this amazing piece that so inspired Sargent that he painted it. It is in the exhibit downstairs. If there's ever been to the exhibit, I hope so. So in this dress, it is a crocheted dress with 1,000 beetle wings. So they're actually jewel beetle wings, which was a popular idea in this time period. And they sewed all of those on. And in theater, if everyone's been to, I used to be a draper at the Huntington Theater Company. If anyone's been to theater, the things that shine under the lights can be really quite amazing, and you have to become, as a costumer, very good friends with your lighting designer to make sure that they're highlighting the work that you're doing. But not only was there these beautiful beetle wings attached, there was also this thread that was attached. So the relationship that's really interesting to me as a draper and a designer is the relationship between the draper, the designer, and the actress. And for those of you who may not have performed in theater before, we build things custom for actresses, almost in a couture sort of way, but in the fastest way possible. We don't have weeks or months to build it. Sometimes you have to drape something in a day. For me, I had to have the knowledge of all of history in order to do that. So I would have to do my homework and my research and study these undergarments and these underpinnings and the way things were cut and where they put seams in order to recreate it for theater, for stage, when we were doing a historical piece. And as the draper working with the designer, you come together in a collaboration, and that collaboration has to be really strong. You have to understand what they want, what they're trying to expose or experience. You have to understand the character and what they would want and what they want to do. In the stage, do they have to do a cartwheel in this dress? Are they storing things in here? All of that sort of thing has to come into foreplay when you're working together. And then finally, you have to put it on a body, which is an incredible intimate situation. When I worked at the Huntington Theater Company, we would go into this fitting room that looked a little bit like a closet, and we would have the performer come in, and then 10 of us would come in after them, and they would get undressed, and we'd then give them clothes to wear. So it's a very intimate situation with a lot of people sort of watching. We sort of changed that system now so that we're sort of allowing them to get dressed while nobody's in the room, which is much more helpful. But as a draper, you're really working with that performer and sculpting that body and figuring out what their needs are and figuring out what their insecurities are. So, as we've learned, sometimes our clothes can make us feel beautiful or powerful or strong, and sometimes they can make us feel awful. Or weird. Sometimes they can build our character. If we're trying to perform, they can make us feel like the weird troll that we're supposed to be. And that's sort of all of that comes together when you're working in theater as a draper and a designer and as an actress. And that's what I think is the most beautiful idea about this garment, is that that's what came together here, is that these three women who were all dress reformers, who were all part of that aesthetic or artistic dress movement, and sort of rallied against the constraints of corseting sort of came together and made this dress. Now, of course, they also idealized this sort of medieval time period, so it's sort of convenient that it's a theater, and it's convenient that it's a, sort of medieval sort of look. But that's sort of what I find is the most interesting about some of this work. So, in ending, I didn't talk that much about Sargent. But he too did the same thing where he sort of altered women, altered the shape of them, altered the color of them, color of their dresses, and kind of created a sort of theater behind the scenes of what he was doing. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Is there any questions? Thank you. Let's end. Do I have any questions? Oh, I don't know. Go ahead.
How often and how would they clean those?
So we will be running a microphone. Sorry for the interruption. We want to run a
So
microphone.
the question was how often would they clean those outer garments? And I think not often. So the most damaging thing you can do to any garment is clean it, honestly. Sun and water, depending on the kind of material. So cellulose fibers like cotton and linen are stronger in water, but protein fibers like wool and silk are weaker in water. And so you wouldn't want to clean them, and that's why we wore all those layers in between our outer garments and our inner garments. And if you had to clean it, you would spot clean it, most likely. So, yeah, wear them a couple times.
Be patient with me as I get the microphone over to you.
I'm sorry, I ended a little too quickly. I got excited. I talked too long. That didn't talk long enough.
And then just a quick reminder that we are streaming, so if you could hold the microphone close to your mouth while you ask your question. Thank you.
Do you have any books you would recommend on the history of undergarments or underpinnings?
There's quite a few. So I do have a list on the handout, and some of those are a little political, like the history of the breast and some of that lingerie. There are some generic ones, but I don't know if I know them off the top of my head. Yeah.
I'm curious how much, I'm over here, how much these dresses would weigh.
Oh, quite well. Between the dresses, the petticoats, the lobster tails, I know when we make garments, they weigh, can be upwards of 20, maybe 20 pounds. I don't know. I do weigh myself without clothing on and then with clothing on, and I weigh like at least 2 pounds more with just this. So I would say 10 to 20 pounds. Heavy.
Who invented the corsets and why?
I don't. It's odd that you can't.
Was it a man or a woman?
I'm curious. Maybe both. We don't. Yeah. I don't know who invented the corsets and why. I mean, they're prior to the 19th century, they were actually called stays, and they were more conical-like. So Marie Antoinette time period, they were wearing more of a cone-type shape. And I wonder why. I bet you it probably was a man. I actually don't know who invented it. Do you know? Do you know? No? Okay, good. There's one of my friends is a historian in the front row, so I'm just cueing her in case I don't know. But I'm sure it was just to control your body or to protect you. I don't know. Or to make you look more what you thought feminine should look like. Is there another question?
I'm wondering how many dresses would somebody wear in a day? And what differentiated, like you showed a tea gown, a ball gown, an evening gown,
Right.
a walking gown,
Right.
So I'm just wondering what differentiates also the different kinds of gowns
There you are.
that they have.
Yeah. So you could wear at least three gowns a day, maybe more, depending on what your day was like, right? So if you spent the day in bed, probably just your bed clothes. If you went out, you had to wear walking clothes. If you were at another person's house, you would wear an evening gown for the nighttime, so on and so forth. So yeah, you could if you were of means, if you were of money, you could change at least 3 times a day. Which is maybe why they didn't get so dirty, is that you didn't wear them for very long. Just for dinner. Right, so the tea gown probably was a little more casual, and so it was softer cut. And there wasn't as much décolletage in sort of day wear, so you really only exposed, this part of your body at night or your arms or something like that. So if you were going out, out into the open, out to the museum for a walk or something like that, you would have covered up your body to not be as sort of exposed. So many questions.
One of the things that's the most striking to me is the waists on these women, which
So
are
small.
so tiny. I
Yeah.
can't imagine a corset nowadays that would make me any place near that. I mean,
No.
what were the dimensions of these waists?
I mean, so there's a bit of trick to this in the history, is that when you're reading stuff, you have to be careful because there is a touch of eroticism in some of the literature where they talk about the small waist and stuff like that. They were pretty small, and when we recreate these patterns, so some of the patterns that we use and some of the readings that I suggested, both the Nora Waugh and the Janet Arnolds, which are two women that kind of recreated these patterns, and when we create them, they're actually really quite small, so they're like kind of 18 inches. But they were smaller in stature, and they would waist train. So you were sort of waist training at a young age to kind of, and when I look at my mom's 1950s gowns that she had a very tight waist, but she was always sort of controlled in that area. And so as we've kind of used like low-rise jeans and a lot of stretch, our bodies kind of like morph into it. Even looking at women's shoes, like women's vintage shoes, they're very narrow, probably because they didn't allow, I wear big old clunky clogs, and so my feet stretch out. So the more you sort of control your body, it'll stay in that shape. So they're very tiny, yeah. Actually, and the other thing they would do is the bones would break through the corset and kind of poke you in not a great way. So they also would put like bone savers on the inside of the corset. So they put an extra layer of bones in there to keep the bones. If anyone's ever worn a dress or something that sort of we call them Merry Widows or long lines, which are like sort of strapless bras with bones in them. When you first put that on, it's a very beautiful, pristine garment, and then by the end of the night, some of the bones have sort of morphed. And so, because they're not, necessarily made of steel, they're usually made of plastic now, so they kind of morph to your bodies.
How did they deal with perspiration? Because I know in the 1950s, there were like women, when they wore a silk dress, would put underpads. So how did they deal if they weren't supposed to clean?
Yeah, so again, part of that weird stuff that's on the inside of those garments, there's something called a pit pad, which is sort of like a piece of material that you put on the armpit that sort of captures it. And they had those as well. And that's another interesting thing when you start to look at women's bodies, and women are biological creatures. We sweat, we have menstruation, we have to go to the bathroom. And so we're sort of always protecting the garments against ourselves, against what we can do to them. So even shaving, or removing of hair, I don't think shaving was until probably closer to World War I. Then I think we used depilatories. World War II. Okay, thank you, Lynn. We should come out here. Any questions?
Hi. You describe yourself as a draper.
Yeah.
And I think I know what it means. Could
Oh,
you
yeah.
describe what you
Yeah.
do as a draper, what you think about, how you feel when you have a model or an actor or actress? Are you considering the lighting, the fall, the nap, whether it's velvet, silk, cotton, linen? If you could describe that,
Yeah.
and possibly relate it to one of Sargent's paintings, perhaps this
Oh,
one,
yeah.
or any of the
Or
paintings.
any of them, yeah.
Yes,
So
thank
that's
you.
like a kind of my favorite topic, and that's why I became sort of a draper sculptor. And draper's sort of it's a theater term, so it's a pattern maker. A draper in theater is a pattern maker. There are 7 ways to make a pattern, one of which is draping. And sort of sculpting material and molding it around the body in a 3-dimension is really the most romantic way to do it. Somebody's waving. Is that at me? Okay, no. So it's the most romantic way to do it. You can do it as a flat patterner with drafting and so on and so forth, but really in theater we sort of drape around the body. And when we work with a designer, oftentimes I would pull, and I worked with some really wonderful designers, Anita Yavich and Bob Morgan, and I would pull them over and we would create the garment together on the form and kind of offer them things they hadn't seen. Sometimes when you see a sketch, it's very flat, and so that's the interesting thing about moving between what Sargent did and what was real in life, is that you can sometimes draw things that you can't drape, and sometimes you can drape things you can't draw. And so that's sort of where when you're working as a draper and a costumer, you sort of work together to kind of create something pretty magical. But it depends on the quality of material. Some of my favorite drapers would be like Madeleine Vionnet or Balenciaga, the sort of more modern drapers. Well, not that modern, but because they really learn to sculpt with the material and allow the material to do what it should do, like allowed it to fall the way it would fall. So if you wanted something to be poofy, you shouldn't use like a heavyweight wool, right? You should use like a taffeta or an organza. Does that answer the question? Okay, good.
Okay, hi. Of course, in the movies, they always have women being laced up in the back, which obviously you need an assistant for that. But for the middle-class women, I'm just curious, kind of over time, eventually there were front fastening corsets, but before then, were they mostly front lacing as well? Or was there actually a sort of class division between who could have help putting on a corset and who didn't wear one as a result?
You've got it. Yeah, exactly. So in order to get into a corset, you do need help. Until about the 20s or 30s, they created something called a corset mécanique, which was sort of a lacing that you could kind of pull around. So you'd kind of shimmy up into the corset and then pull it tight, and I have seen people do that today. It wasn't until the slot and spoon busk was probably more 1850s, 1860s, where they could quick release and get into them themselves. But mostly if you're wearing a corset and you're that restricted in movement, you're probably not working for a living as much, I would say. So yeah, there's usually a difference. And people would inherit corsets, they would pass corsets on. Who's next? Any other questions?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
What kind of stockings did they wear, or did they wear stockings?
That's really interesting. So has anyone heard of a Luddite? The Luddite riots were about stockings. So the Luddite riots in England is when they sort of mechanized stocking making. And so the people that hand knitted stockings revolted, and they sort of smashed the machines that made silk stockings. So stockings would have been knitted or crocheted into shape. And yes, and there's garter belts. So when you see corsets, you often see these kind of tabs or strings hanging off of corsets, and they would have, that's how you would attach. I don't think pantyhose were until the 1960s, right? Yes, thank you. I keep checking with my history. They had roll garters. There you go. Little elastics around your legs. Not very comfortable.
I have a question from our online audience. Lori asks, how would your age have affected how quickly you would have changed with the trends versus keeping with the corset or shape you knew and liked best?
How your age would affect that. Yeah, so, the younger women would have been more adventurous, even with color and corsetry. And I'm sure, as we've all had mothers that wanted us to wear something that we didn't want to wear. I was talking to somebody right before we started, and we were talking about how when I was growing up, you didn't leave the house in a skirt without pantyhose or stockings. You would never let your bra strap show. And then that shifted as young people, sort of like push against that. And so the same thing with corsetry is that, the mothers would have wanted their daughters to start waist training. Remember, this is all happening before we had the right to vote. So the only thing we had was this body that we could entice somebody to marry. So mothers would have wanted their daughters to sort of fit into society and fit into that sort of role so they could find a good match. So much freedoms now. We can wear pants.
I'm asking for our row here, who was, what did they wear when they weren't going out?
What were they wearing when?
What did the women wear when they were not going out at home?
So at home, they could wear a tea gown or something like that, or a robe. They probably wore much simpler garments, so on and so forth. So it depends on what they were doing. If they were at home and having people over, then they would have dressed appropriately for guests. When they slept, they would wear like sort of a long nightgown or something like that. Yeah, they were rarely naked. Maybe during a bath.
Could you comment on the Gilded Age costumes that are currently on television?
Gosh, yeah. The funny thing about either theater or film is there's always compromises, and so sometimes when you watch things, I don't know if I can comment specifically on the Gilded Age, but sometimes they're tight lacing in time periods where they weren't really tight lacing, right? So they're sort of pretending like people were pulling themselves in when they weren't really pulling themselves in as much as they were. So even watching like a young Victoria film, they're sort of pulling them in and sort of restricting them more in a way than they were. We really didn't start tight lacing as much until we got, with Napoleon and Empire and Directoire time period of 1800, we sort of almost got rid of the corset for a second, and it was really just a firm bodice, almost like a bra-like device. Wasn't that lovely? And somehow we went right back into that tight waist, tight lacing. And so when you're watching those sort of films, there is a little bit of editorial excitement. Again, there's a little eroticism in corsets, right? And so people like to think of them as this kind of fantasy that didn't always happen. Yes? I don't know. I don't have
How did the dresses affect women's gynecological problems and their bone structure as they grew older?
Right. So there's I think another myth is that people got ribs removed. That I don't think anyone would have survived that, honestly. But they did sort of morph. So you can look at actually women today who are tight lacing and now have to wear corsets all of the time because they've tight laced so much that they no longer have the muscle structure to sort of hold their bodies up. And often, again, like I talked about the corsets sort of piercing the body, it also was sort of awkward to go to the doctor about these sort of things. And so all of that, and I didn't show these, but they also have, they had pregnancy corsets, which I think would have been maybe comfortable, maybe not. I think it would be terrible, but it wasn't great. It's not. I don't suggest it. So, live your freedoms, but choose your destinies. So yes, it was tricky. It was tricky, even with menstruation and all of that stuff. So it sort of altered the way your body sort of grew and changed. Does that answer that question? Kind of. They stayed at home. When they had their periods, they stayed at home. The red tent or something like that, yeah.
So when did corseting begin? And maybe you answered this and I missed it. The Egyptian women, from paintings, it looks like they weren't wearing undergarments at all.
Right.
But when did that start?
Well, we have, sort of they probably started stiffening their bodices in medieval times, and then by probably the Renaissance is when they sort of started wearing those sort of stiff cone-like bodices that sort of held them together and created a really, really tight shape. And some of that probably was just to show that they had enough money to do that. So to be able to restrict your movement and wear something that stiffened, sort of showed that you had the money to not work for a living. And I think that's sort of where that idealized, came from. Goodness gracious.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Penny, for the wonderful lecture.